Mm-hmm.
Hello and welcome to the Church Society podcast. I'm Ros Clarke. I'm the Associate Director of Church Society, and this week I'm joined by Lee Gatiss, Director of Church Society, and Mark Wallace, Regional Director of Church Society. It is the director's cut, I feel, this morning. Well, maybe not.
Which one of us are you going to cut, Ros?
Well, I mean, clearly George, because he's not here. There we go. If you're listening to the podcast, please subscribe. You can now subscribe to us on Spotify as well as on iTunes and all other good podcast providers. If you're watching us, you can subscribe on YouTube, and don't forget to click the little bell sign to make sure you get notification every time we upload a video. Just a couple of pieces of news before we get going. I wanted to let you know about our summer sermon series. You may have seen posts about this. We have 9 sermons available in both video and also, as of today, audio that are available for you to download and use in whatever way is most helpful for your church over the summer. I mean, you might want to just take the whole summer off, but you might just say, do you know what, I just really need a break for a week or two. Here's a sermon from trusted, reliable preachers. Rod Thomas, Wallace, Mark and Lee have both contributed some. So those are available from the Church Society website. We'll put a link to that in the comments as well. And I also just wanted to let you know, sadly, we have had to take the decision this year that we won't be able to go ahead with our normal residential conference for junior Anglicans at the end of the summer. But instead, we are having a virtual Summer of Jake, starting in mid-July, going all the way through to the first week of September. Keynote papers, seminars, workshops, all kinds of things. It will be free. It is available to anyone who is in that sort of junior stage. So anything up to the first couple of years of incumbency, all the way back to just beginning to think about full-time ministry, maybe your ministry trainee, or what kind of anyone at that sort of stage in their ministry. You're very welcome to join us, but you do need to sign up. It is free, but you do need to sign up. So again, we'll put the links to that, and we hope to see many of you this summer at some of those events. Now, we don't often get to do really breaking news on this podcast, and sadly, probably by the time you get to see or hear this on Tuesday, it won't be quite as breaking as it feels we're recording this on Monday. But today, the government has announced new guidance for the safe use of places of worship that will apply from July the 4th, so starting this weekend. Lee, just give us some of the sort of headline news about what's now going to be permitted.
Well, that's right, Ros. One of the big thing is that there's now no limit of 30 for public worship, as there was before for weddings and funerals. The limit still applies for weddings and funerals, but if your building is big enough and you can manage the people flow, the stewarding, and all the other restrictions and important things that need to be put in place, you can have more than 30 people in your building now for public worship. So that's the big thing that the governments have announced.
Great.
There are a whole load of restrictions that you need to think about to put into place to make that happen. And so it may not be happening soon in a church near you.
Yeah, absolutely. So Mark, I mean, you're an incumbent of a church at the moment. Just give us an idea, what kind of things will you and your wardens and PCC need to be thinking about this week as you start to look through this guidance?
Well, first to say that the 2 churches I work with in Colchester, we've already made the decision that we won't be opening this coming Sunday. And part of that is because we're aware on past form that it's quite likely the detailed government advice and diocesan advice won't be available until the 11th hour, which makes it very hard to be planning for this Sunday. Now, some churches will be in a position to do that, and that's great. But we locally have decided that we're not able to do that this soon. The main thing that we've been encouraging each other to do is to look very, very carefully at the detail of the advice. We're quite used now to there being government announcements that come out, but actually the detail is where the important elements are. That doesn't come out until a few days later. There may well be some nuancing even of the government advice that's come out overnight. So we still need to watch this space. You flick down on the website and there's an awful lot to read, but it does need to be read. And most of us, I imagine, will also be receiving advice from our diocese, from our diocesan bishop, probably in the next 24, 36 hours. That will also need to be read very, very carefully. I speak as somebody who loves just to flick past the dull stuff, but actually on this, we need to be very careful, please.
Yeah, we really do. I think that's right. I think the big headline, churches are open, needs to be taken with a huge pinch of salt.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things I really want to say to people listening to this. If you're not a church leader, if you're not on the PCC, you're not involved in those discussions, please be really patient. And don't be just sort of knocking on the door saying, why aren't we back to normal this Sunday? Because it just won't be as straightforward as that makes it sound. There is good news. Some of you will remember a couple of weeks ago we had Phil Hobbs on the podcast talking about how his wedding has had to be postponed. Weddings we do now know are able to go ahead, and up to 30 people, you know, so hopefully for most couples you'll at least be able to get most of your close family there, and you know, your best man and your bridesmaids and so on. So it won't be quite the same as people had perhaps planned for originally, but those should be able to go ahead in some form this summer. One of the things I noticed in the guidance that's come out today, there is some discussion about what they call, I think, life cycle events or something like that, which I mean, it makes it sound to me a little bit like we're talking about sort of the change from a larva into a butterfly, but I don't think that's quite what they mean. So in our context, that would really be things like baptism and confirmation, and I think also communion, possibly there is some related things there. What does it say about those kind of things, Lee?
It says one thing: you can't be singing in those services, in any of the services. So that's a big thing to note. Maybe one person could sing with a guitar, not a wind instrument, but with a guitar up the front with some plexiglass in front of them. I'd wondered if maybe if they turn their back to you and just face the wall while they sing, that might work as well. But I don't think so. It's not a good idea. But yes, so you will be able to have a baptism, but not by full immersion. They actually say no full immersion, but you might be able to do some splashing, provided nobody else gets splashed at the same time. For an infant baptism, you will want the parent to keep hold of the child, not the minister, but you could still splash them, maybe from a distance. I don't know how you work that out, but it can still be done.
So one of the things it says is there is a difference between the status of some of the guidance. So some of it is must. Yes. So those are legal requirements, and some of it is should, which is best guidance. And so some of these things come under different things around that. And one of the differences is around what social distancing counts as. So it's 2 meters, but that could be as little as 1 meter if there are other mitigating things put into place. So, you know, if you were wearing a mask, for example, and the parents were wearing a mask, and probably you don't put masks on tiny babies, but, you know, and then you're sort of pouring from a sort of height over the child, you could do that, I think, at that sort of meter distance, rather than having to get a water pistol and aim it from the other side of the room.
I think the 1 meter thing could be interesting as well, because one of the big things about church buildings is pinch points around the building. I think about our church in Cambridge here. There's a pinch point when people arrive, and they often come by bike, of course, because we're in Cambridge, where you go around to put your bike, and then people come out of there into church, isn't very wide. And they're going to have to think about that pinch point. Similarly, in the church building, when you come out of the main worship area, for want of a better word, and to go to the loos or to the meeting point or out of the building, again, there could be a pinch point there. And different buildings will need to think through how they manage that and signpost that and steward that. And it may not be possible for many. And we are not failing in our gospel proclamation if we don't open the building, because we're trying to care for people and to look after their physical health in that way. It is still fine to be streaming your services, Zooming, YouTubing, because your building is not ready under the current restrictions to be opened. Some will be able to open, and it's fine. It's great that they can do that. and have more than 30, maybe even meeting in the car park, or if the church has extensive grounds out the back, the church where I was a curate, we had a big piece of grass land out the back of the church, the glebe land it used to be, I think, and you could meet there. But not every church will be able to do this. And so you're not failing in your gospel duty to your people if you are continuing just to do it by the internet.
No, that's right. And I mean, the guidance is still pretty clear on that people who've been in the shielding category, so there is some easing of shielding is happening this week, and those people who've been in that category will be able to go out a bit and meet with other people a little bit, but they are still advised not to come to any big gatherings. So we shouldn't be expecting those people to rock up to church, even if we can open. And so I think most churches are going to want to think maybe about some kind of double provision at some point. I don't know, Mark, whether you've thought about what that might entail in your situation.
Yes, very much. But just to go back a stage, I think it's also worth saying in the government advice that's come out, there are no big surprises. And most clergy and church wardens and PCCs that I know of have been debating this for the last few weeks. So there are no surprises, and people have already thought this through. So it may well be in your local context that if a decision has been announced about the coming Sundays, that it has been a very well thought through issue. Again, though, can I just make a plea? Do go back to the detail of the advice. I even have a sneaky suspicion, Lee, there may be a couple of bits and pieces in there that may not be entirely accurate, though we can parse the government advice bit by bit later on if we need to. But in terms of going forwards, sorry, yes, anyway. In terms of going forwards, yes, I think we're needing to be very careful, but also acknowledge that there are difficult decisions. We are looking at dual ministry. We're going to be doing online and offline, quite possibly beyond Christmas and into the new year. But I think it's also worth flagging out there's a particular bit there. The issue here is, I think, that a lot of people are about to go away on holiday. Options have been opened up for folk to go away. We're aware of particular individuals who won't be around for particular weeks in July and August. At the very stage that we're reliant on people to help open up the building in a much more complicated way, and we're looking still to be able to make an online provision. Actually, this is going to be a really complicated couple of months for us to work our way through.
I absolutely agree, and that's partly why we provided the summer sermon series, is that awareness that not only will ministers need a break, but actually there'll be all the people they might have been relying on to help with technology, all the practical things if we are opening buildings. People are really stretched to their limit, and I don't know any clergy who've had a quiet time these last few months. Everybody I know has been absolutely working to the max and really stretched, and suddenly we're asking to continue with everything that has been going on and do more, and as you say, at a time when also people will be wanting to try and take breaks. So
just to clarify, we're not saying that clergy haven't had a quiet time.
No.
And they've been reading their Bible and praying, I hope. But yes, it has not been a peaceful time of putting your feet up and relaxing.
Really not. So complicated. Now, one other thing I just wanted to pick up that was in the guidance this morning, the thing that sort of at the beginning of lockdown or just before lockdown, a lot of churches were thinking about this subject, and it's kind of gone quiet because we've not been able to do anything about it. But that is the issue of communion. So obviously, normally when we receive communion in an Anglican church, the bread is shared and we receive wine from a common cup. So immediately the sort of pandemic crisis hit, the issue of the common cup was one that people were very, very rightly concerned about as a possible way of transmitting the virus. In the guidance this morning, it's very clear that you can't share a common cup. But it does seem to suggest that we could be sharing bread in some way. There's guidance about the person distributing, sanitizing their hands or wearing gloves and then sort of dropping it into your hand. I don't think there's any guidance about dropping it into your mouth if you're in a church that has that tradition.
You mustn't do that. It says into the hand only. Okay,
good. Well, that's good. So there is that. But that does then, I think, raise some of those questions again. Is it okay to have communion if we only share bread? is it communion if we only share bread? Why can't we just use those little individual cups that you may have seen if you've been, lots of Baptist churches use them and other denominations as well, where we're not sharing a common cup, we're just all drinking a little bit. Why don't we just do that?
There is an ancient provision for this. So the 39 Articles, of course, tell us that the sacrament ought to be given to people in both kinds. This is Article 30, as I recall. The sacrament is to be given both as bread and wine, not the way that many parts of the medieval church used to do it, just giving the people bread and not giving them wine. So the Reformation restored that, that the people could be allowed the wine as well. However, there is provision even during the Reformation in the Sacrament Act of 1547, which is still in effect,
right? Which
says that it should be both bread and wine, except necessity otherwise require.
Interesting.
And I think that is including the idea that there may be plague or the sweating sickness, as it might have been known back then.
Which was certainly a big
yes,
deal in the 16th century. It
absolutely was.
Yeah.
It absolutely was. So I think that even the reformers at that point were saying, yes, bread and wine should be the normal mode of giving the sacrament, but necessity may require us not to give it as wine. So I used to be pretty fundamentalist about Article 30 and saying we shouldn't do it in both, we shouldn't do it in one kind only. But I think there may be circumstances where it's possible to just do it by bread. Whether that's ideal is another issue. Well, I don't think it is ideal.
Clearly it's not ideal, but it may be possible. Would you do that? And does the Sacrament Act of 1547, which I've only just heard about for the first time, say, in that case, would you expect the minister to also only receive in one kind, or would you expect him to receive in both kinds, while the people only receive the bread?
I think it would be possible for the minister to receive in both kinds, because the necessity that's being spoken of is a plague. So the minister could still receive bread and wine, but not to pass on the wine, which would be in a shared chalice.
Yeah. Okay.
Now that's an issue, isn't it, for today? So the shared chalice is something we've generally used in Anglicanism, because it has that idea of we all eat from one bread, we eat from one loaf of bread, and we drink from a common chalice. Now, that's an issue in these sorts of circumstances, and we could get around it by having individual cups. And I know lots of people do that in non-conformist churches, but some bishops get very touchy about that and don't want us to use individual cups in the Church of England.
I mean, you say just some bishops. I mean, there is some canon law about it, isn't there? It's not just individual bishops getting on their high horse and telling us what to do, I think. Isn't that right, Mark? You're kind of nodding at me.
I believe that is the case, but I vow to leave superior knowledge of canon law.
Okay. Well, I have not done the research on canon law either, but I believe that is the case as well. I would refer people who want to think more about this. As I say, at the beginning of lockdown, it was a thing a lot of people think about quite a lot. Can we do virtual communion? Can we do communion in one kind? And so on. We have a series of blog posts that Mark Lloyd wrote for us, addressing various questions around this that I would really recommend. And actually, there's another one which I'm going to post later this week from him, just encouraging us to think about what we should be thinking about and doing at communion as we begin to get to a point where we're celebrating it again. There's also, sort of coincidentally, an article in the latest edition of Crossway that Church Society members and subscribers will be getting this week. But if you're not a subscriber or a member, you can always buy an individual copy from the Church Society website. Paul Darlington's written, it's a series of 2 articles, the first of which is in this quarterly Crossway about what we're doing at communion and why it matters. So if you want to think more about those questions, I would commend those things to you. But again, I think I want to say to people, I know this is a thing that for a lot of people we have been really missing, and I think that's a good thing if people have been missing communion and feeling hungry for communion. But again, we may just need to be patient and accept that even if we're able to get back to church in some way, it may be a while before we're able to share communion in anything like a normal sort of way. And again, just understand that there are reasons for that, and it's not because anyone's wanting to withhold from you a means of grace that God has given us. It is for your protection and safety.
I think it's also worth saying that we can expect quite detailed advice to come through from bishops and archdeacons very soon, so we should take note on that. And it is a slight bugbear of mine. I'm not sure now is the time to be considering episcopal disobedience over this, given how hard the church authorities and the government authorities have tried to balance the needs of freedom on the one hand with the public health risk on the other. I'm not going to pretend I've got any more insight than they have into the health risks. I'm not sure this is the time to be going against the advice.
Yeah, I think that's really right. It's not coming from a position of let's persecute those Christians. It's not coming from a position of let's try and frustrate gospel ministry. There are clear, good and important reasons.
It's also important to say that we do still feed on Christ in our hearts by faith when we listen and receive his holy word and the preaching of it. So we're not denied something substantial in that sense. We can feed on Christ in our hearts by faith as we hear his word and as people preach on it and we accept and receive that. What we're being denied is communal gathering, is feeding on Christ by means of the Lord's Supper. But it's the same thing that we feed on. We feed on Christ. And so, we can still be sustained in our faith despite not having the Lord's Supper, which is still something we should be longing to do, but isn't going to be happening in a normal way for a long time, I don't think.
I think that's right. I really hope that one of the sort of lasting effects of this period for people will be that sense of valuing and longing for those things which are so important, the meeting together, and yes, the sharing of bread and wine, and those things which we've not been able to do, and that we feel that greater longing for them.
I listened to 4 sermons on Sunday yesterday. I just love being able to do that.
How many did you preach in the same place at the same time?
I was only preaching in one church yesterday at Holy Trinity Old Hill on Nehemiah, which was great. But I listened to several sermons on YouTube. It was just lovely to be able to do that and to feed on Christ in that way. It's just great.
Lots of blessings. Good. Well, let's just move on and rather more briefly. Some of you will have seen the news last week that Evangelicals Now, a regular monthly newspaper, Christian newspaper, has appointed a new editor. They've appointed David Baker. David is an Anglican clergyman. He ministers down in West Sussex. He's a Church Society member and an all-round good egg. He, in his former life, was a journalist, and has continued to be involved in Christian journalism while he's been in church ministry, and is going to continue. He's not leaving his parishes. He's going to continue with that as he takes on this new role. And it just made me think, what is the place of those kinds of newspapers? So various newspapers, Evangelicals Now, people may also know Church of England newspaper or Church Times, or those sorts of newspapers. That's not where I get my news these days. So, for example, the news we've just been talking about, the government guidance, I saw the link to that on a Facebook group this morning. I did not go to a newspaper website, let alone wait for a newspaper to drop through my letterbox. Do either of you subscribe to any Christian newspapers? Where do you get your Christian news from?
Well, the things like Church Times, I try to read every week, and the Church of England newspaper, Evangelicals Now, Evangelical Times, those are the ones. So they're usually weekly or monthly, these things. Occasionally you get things that are quarterly as well. They're not daily newspapers like the Telegraph, the Times, the Guardian, or the Daily Mail or something like that. I think the role of daily news for Christians is taken by blogs and by Facebook and social media, Twitter, Instagram, even maybe for some.
Which then raises a question, doesn't it? If we've all seen all the news because it's come online within hours, what is the value of something that comes out weekly or monthly?
Well, I think Evangelicals Now is particularly good at this, is very good at giving us a digest of the news from around the world. So you will get stuff from all over the world of interest to evangelicals now, as to what's going on in Africa, Indonesia, Malaysia, South America, in different parts of the world, so we can pray and know what's going on. Of course, mixed up within a lot of this is pages and pages of comment as well. We get lots of comment and lots of opinion on things, which you do also get online, but you kind of hope that if it's in a newspaper, it's been filtered through an editorial team, been thought about more carefully.
Yeah.
And so it might be a little bit more reliable or worth reading than many Twitter posts.
Yeah, so I think that point about sort of getting outside of your social media bubble is a good one. You know, you may be very good at choosing who you follow online and where you read and getting that broad picture of news, but most of us are not. Most of us tend to just follow the people we know and the things we already know, and so we get a sort of echo chamber of ourselves. So something which is deliberately pushing beyond that is a good thing. Is there still a role, do you think, for investigative journalism? Where do we see that happening? Because that, I don't think, is something that social media generally does. Social media is very good at sharing a link and having an opinion on it, but actually finding a story, doing that investigative work, where do you see that happening, Mark?
Well, I'm not sure I see it happening very much at all at the moment, and I think that's a big concern. It's worth remembering how expensive it is, because you're needing to pay people to do that work. I think there are some examples you can point to. I think the Archbishop Cranmer blog would be one example. I think likewise some of Ian Paul's work is excellent. We might not agree with all of it, but there's a lot that's very, very helpful there. But yeah, beyond that, you can point to examples, but you can't point to a culture of investigative journalism. And I suspect that probably evangelical Christianity in this country is the weaker for it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's not a thing that is happening a lot. And I'm sure you're right, it's a lot to do with how expensive it is. And I think many of these sort of publications are struggling to hang on financially, is my guess. We've seen that with secular newspapers and secular journalism struggling to hold their place in an internet culture, and I'm sure the same is true for Christian publications. It's interesting to me that when lockdown was announced, Church of England newspapers, a weekly newspaper, went online only, and I do wonder if they will ever go back to being a print publication. I wonder whether they can afford to.
But on this issue that you're talking about, investigative journalism, you know, Church of England newspaper does not employ that many people to actually do the work. A lot of what appears in there, and in Evangelicals Now, of course, is actually just the editor saying to Church Society or to another organisation, please give us something for this month. And so there's a regular rolling, an item from Watch, an item from the Church Mission Society, and that's what you get in there. You don't get investigative journalism. And the one or two people who may be employed by the publication are busy producing all the other stories. They haven't got time to devote to doing lots of investigation. So who broke the story about John Smythe and his abuse? Channel 4.
Yeah.
Who broke the story about Jonathan Fletcher and what he was up to? The Telegraph.
Yeah.
So you get a crossover with things the world might be interested in, scandalous things, and the world investigates them. But things that might actually be of real interest to Christians about what's really going on in the Christian world, I don't think the world knows about them or cares about them. So you won't get the BBC looking into those things. When the BBC did a story recently about how my faith is helping me through lockdown, the people that they got to talk about that were not representative of most people in the church. I think the one, anyway, I mean, look that story up. Look that story up.
That's true. I mean, there have been some great counterexamples. There was a lovely piece, wasn't there, in, I think, The Independent, with somebody talking about her faith in her church family during lockdown and how great that had been. But I agree, in general, we shouldn't be, and we can't rely on the secular media to do that work for us, because they have their own agenda. And so I would love to see Christian journalists really taking that mantle on. And I don't know how you pay for that, and I don't know how you make that happen. I think also you mentioned there, Lee, about how a lot of these publications, what they're doing is sort of aggregating stories from other organisations, parachurch organisations, places like Church Society. And again, I wonder who is doing the sort of scrutiny of that. who is doing the scrutiny of, you know, what is happening with Fulcrum, what are CEC up to, and is it the right thing? Who is doing that kind of bigger overview scrutiny? Because organisations with the best will in the world aren't best placed to do it for themselves, and don't feel that it's appropriate to comment on each other particularly. So, you know, I would just love there to be a place where that sort of work is happening as well, at a bigger picture. Well, it'll be interesting to see. Yeah, go on, Mark.
I was going, but possibly they're helpful just to reinforce that things like Facebook groups can also these days be incredibly helpful. There are some people who do know what they're talking about, who have a reputation for talking sense and for being in the know. And we are very privileged in many ways at the moment to be able to engage with those people online. I'm just thinking, for example, of someone like John Stevens, who's been doing some cracking work about the opening of churches. And that information has been made available by him very, very quickly, far more quickly than would be by investigative journalists. So it's not all doom and gloom, but yes, I'd take the bigger
No,
picture.
I absolutely agree. And I think that's the thing, isn't it? There's so many things that social media does do really well and quickly and responsively that we're all benefiting from. But I just worry about what we're losing that social media doesn't do so well, because it's taking away from that. Anyway, we wish David and Evangelicals Now very well, and we look forward to seeing how things develop there. Great. Who has got some things to recommend? Mark, you had a book you were going to mention, I think.
Yes, I've been rereading recently this book by Paul David Tripp, Dangerous Calling. I think I've now read it 3 or 4 times, but particularly rereading it at the moment because his central thesis is that pastors need to be in community if they are to be supported, cared for, and accountable. And one of the issues I struggled with, and a lot of other ministers I've spoken to over the last few months have really struggled with, is that sense of how to have that openness and accountability in community when you can't be meeting with people. Zoom is an option, but it's limited. There are others as well. So I've been rereading that, thinking what that might look like over the coming weeks and months, given that the lockdown restrictions are only being lifted slowly. And I'm just really... I'm impressed on the one hand with the argument, and I need to think through how to apply it personally in the light of the changes we've seen in the last few months. I'm also saddened, I won't go into detail, but if you look again at the names on the back of the book, those who've commended it, there are some very sad examples of where this has gone badly wrong for some, and a strong sense of there, but for the grace of God go we. And a real encouragement to pastors perhaps over the summer, when hopefully there'll be a chance for things to slow down a little bit, to think about how we set ourselves up with perhaps slightly different support structures and accountability in the light of the changes we've been facing.
That's really helpful. You may have seen Dan Steele, he's a minister in a free church in Oxford, did a survey a few weeks ago, and that was the thing that came out really strongly, was ministers feeling the need for those support networks of people in similar situations. And he mentioned, which I don't think I had really thought of in this context before, that in Calvin's Geneva, they had that sort of weekly habit of the church leaders gathering for that kind of mutual support and accountability. And, you know, I think most of us, even if we have those kind of support systems, maybe it's once every 3 months, or maybe it's a phone call once a month, but that sort of ongoing regular check-in, and how valuable that is. Lee, have you got anything for us?
Well, my bedtime reading is the Synopsis Purioris Theologiae, the Leiden Synopsis of 1625 in Latin.
Good, well, I'll put a link to that in the programme notes.
I'm sure lots of people are interested in that. But the other thing is, I did a talk last week on Friday for the Southwark Diocesan Evangelical Group. They'd asked me to talk about the doctrine of God, so the topic we came up with was pleasing the impassible God, and looking at impassibility and immutability. How God doesn't change, and he doesn't have vulnerability to passions as we do. So 2 books I could recommend particularly on that sort of subject, on the doctrine of God. One would be Matthew Barrett's excellent book, None Greater. I've got it on Kindle, so I can't show you my copy of it. None Greater, the Undomesticated Attributes of God, which is just excellent on these classical theism, what it means by God being omniscient, omnipresent, immutable, impassible, and so on. And the other excellent book on these things is Gary Williams's book, His Love Endures Forever, which is a beautiful book. It reminded me a lot, reading it, of Jim Packer's book, Knowing God, which is high praise, isn't it? And it's got some great reflections on how these things apply to us in our Christian lives, and some prayerful meditations on that. So Gary Williams, His Love Endures Forever. It's a great book.
Lovely. I love that undomesticated attributes. It reminds me, of when Aslan is described as not being tame. We don't have a tame, domesticated God. We have an undomesticated God. Good. I was going to recommend something, but I'm slightly nervous to do it now, because I think, did both of you study history as your first degree?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, good. Right, so I don't really know anything about history, but I've really been enjoying a series of historical novels.
Bear in mind, as historians, we immediately claim that whatever it is not our period.
No,
So we're completely safe.
It's definitely Lee's period, though. It's 17th century. It's a series of books, Roundheads and Cavaliers by Stella Riley. The first one is The Black Madonna. They're a bit gruesome. I had to skip over some of the battle scenes and the siege and the gruesomeness of it.
The Siege of Colchester, where Mark is.
Yeah, actually, that's not the one. It's the Siege of Banbury that you get in real detail.
I wasn't there at the time, Lee.
but there is there certainly is reference to the Siege of Colchester and people eating rats, and anyway.
Splendid.
But what I really like about them, they're great books, and she writes really well, and they're very gripping, and they're long, which if you're needing something to occupy your mind at the moment, it's a good thing. But she really captures, I think, the sort of chaos and confusion of the whole period. So they start just before the Civil War starts, and they go through not quite as far as I can't remember how far into the Commonwealth you get, but that sort of lengthy period, and people with divided loyalties and changing sides and complicated politics, and
it's all a bit too close to home. It's like all the Brexit arguments, and then followed by not being able to get a delivery slot from Tesco, which means you end up eating rats and arguing with people about Brexit online. So
it's
too close to home.
A bit like
it's
that.
Not really
anyway,
fiction.
I enjoy those.
An apocalyptic note to end the podcast on.
Anyway, if you feel like that's a period of history that you feel like you'd ought to understand better, but you're not going to read a book that's half in Latin, I recommend those.
Read the Leiden synopsis.
Good. Well, anyway, on that note, thank you all for watching and or listening. Don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to tune in again next week.